to record. So we are, I've started the recording. So I would like everybody to welcome Professor Stephen Saupe. He is a teaching professor from the University of St. John's University in the College of St. Benedict's. He is the curator of the College of St. Benedict's and St. John's University Bailey Herbarium.
That's good.
I've invited him to give us a little presentation on from Abe Lincoln to Mastodons, Botanical Tales.
Sounds good. So I'll tell you a few stories. I'll share my screen here in just a second, but if you have questions, I don't know, Steve, were you going to just have them? You can just yell them out if you want. Well, you can take a break. Whatever you think is going to be the best solution.
A lot of times somebody will ask a question right away, so I'll usually just break in. I have them type it in the chat window, but yeah, we try to usually hold the questions till end. But if you would like them to go ahead and ask them.
I think whatever works for you guys. I mean, they can wait till the end or right away.
Okay.
So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, wonderful. All right, so again, thanks for the invite. Really happy to be able to be here and share some fun, or what I'll call charming, stories about some of our Minnesota plants with you. I got the word charming from one of our monks at St. John's, Alexius Hoffman, who back in 1934 wrote actually was a handwritten document that he called The Natural History of Collegeville. That's where St. John's is. And in it, he says, a state as far north as Minnesota might be supposed to be unfavorable to the development of a fascinating flora. Yet even this corner of God's country has its charms, modest though they may be when compared with other countries. So what I'll try to do is show you some charming plants of our world here in Minnesota. And I'm going to start with this one. Normally, as a classroom teacher, I like to ask my students lots of questions. And if we were doing this in person, I would put this image up and ask you, hey, what plant is this? And if anyone wants to yell it out, feel free to do so. I'll give you a second to think about it anyway, and then maybe I'll just go right on, since it might be harder to do that in this format. But you may recognize this tree, which is a fairly common lawn tree here in Minnesota. It has two kinds of leaves. It has the single pinnately compound leaf, kind of like a feather. And then it also has these twice pinnately compound leaves, like the one on the left side. And I wound up somehow showing you the answer. So this is a honey locust tree, Leditsia triacanthos. And our native ones have these humongous thorns on them, which are really cool. All right, so we're gonna start there. Honey locust trees are planted all over Minnesota. However, they're native to areas a little bit further south and east of us. And if you look at this gray shaded area, they come into just this extreme southeast corner of the state. Welby Smith, our Minnesota botanist, recently published a book on our trees, and he hasn't been able to find any living populations now. So the wild version may be extinct, although I have seen a couple of them that have probably escaped. But the bottom line is, at one point, they probably did get into just the very south corner, but now they are a real common landscape tree. But the ones you'll see in your yard are not like the wild ones because they don't have any thorns on them. They're called variety inermis. And the reason they're planted so extensively in our lawns is because they cast a light shadow. And so it allows for the grass to grow nicely underneath them. It's kind of just a dappled, nice sunlight. Also, they grow very quickly. Excuse me. When the American elms basically met their demise, most people started replanting with these honey locust trees. The honey locust has separate male and female trees. We call that dioecious. So, or some species, or some individuals can be polygamodioecious, which simply means they have separate male and female flowers. These are the males, I believe. The fruits, oh my goodness, it keeps flipping on me, sorry. The fruits you've probably noticed hanging on some trees. They are these long, curly, flattened pods. And inside of the pod, as well, at least when they're young, you'll see a sweet pulp that surrounds the individual seeds. And that sweet pulp is what gives the tree its name honey, as in honey locust. And it is edible, so you could open up the pods and scoop it out. And if you wanted to go to that effort, it's not bad. I've tried it, but that's about as far as I would go with it. And that pulp then surrounds, the pods will accumulate on the ground beneath the trees, which you may have noticed. And then within the pods, you'll find the seeds. They're about the size of a bean, a flattened bean, and they're extremely hard, almost as hard as a marble. And in order to get them to germinate, at least at home, we would want to scarify them, take a file or some sandpaper, and just put a little nick in the seed coat in order to allow them to take up water. All right, so that's kind of an overview of honey locust, but now the question for you would be, how were those fruits and seeds of the honey locust tree dispersed? How did they move from one place to another? And we saw how the pods accumulated on the ground, and I'll give you a clue as you're thinking about the answer. It has to do with these nasty thorns that we saw on the trunk of the wild trees. So why would these trees produce such nasty thorns? And if you've ever looked at the tree, a wild tree, you'll see that these thorns stop about 15 foot up the trunk. And so the answer, which maybe many of you already know, is that we think that these fruits were eaten and dispersed by now extinct animals that would have been common back during the Pleistocene period here in Minnesota. And so things like ground sloths would have been munching on the pods for that nice sweet pulp. Mastodons, and here's where part of the title comes from, would have been munching on these things. And then as they ate the pods, they would have been moving them to a new location and depositing the seeds in a nice pile of fertilizer. And the trip through the digestive tract would have helped a little bit in terms of seed germination. So these plants really are what we're going to call a botanical anachronism. And what we mean by an anachronism is that they are essentially a plant out of place. Well, here are two other botanical anachronisms. Avocado is one, and then you might be able to recognize ginkgo fruits in the picture on the lower right would be another. So these plants, honey locust pods, if you're familiar with Kentucky coffee trees, they're another. Ginkgos and avocado are all plants that are essentially anachronisms. They have evolved to have these kinds of fruits, but their fruit dispersers are no longer with us. They have gone extinct. And if you want to read more about this phenomenon, this book, Ghosts of Evolution, is a wonderful one by Connie Barlow, published a few years back, but it talks all about these different kinds of anachronisms. Just to give you an example of these, I have a little video clip here we'll show you. Hopefully this works. My skills are not so great. I'm going to try it though. We're going to click on that. All right. Can you see the video by any chance?
No, we're still seeing the Ghosts of Evolution.
All right. So now, whoops. Now I'm going to have to go back and share this. So I have to get rid of that. So how do I do this? So I stop share here. And now I have to go to here and click on that. How about now?
Yep, I think we do see it. Oh, it went away. It was there
Okay,
for a
super.
moment.
Yep, I forgot to put sound on for you. So we'll try it again. All right, so here we go. We'll give this a try.
Rustling leaves and, oh God, what is that smell? It smells like somebody threw up all over Brooklyn. Don't blame him. Blame this tree, the ginkgo biloba. The ginkgo biloba is a weird tree. It was here before every flowering plant on Earth. It watched dinosaurs play under its leaves and then go extinct, or turn into pigeons. Out of the 5 categories of plants that make seeds, the ginkgo, just one species, is all on its own. It's kind of an evolutionary oddity. And their seeds smell awful. Beneath your feet, that squishy carpet oozes out the same chemical found in rancid butter. And that seems like a strange strategy if your goal is to make baby trees. Unfortunately for plants, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Now, unlike their airborne cousins, seeds need to be carried off so that they don't compete with their parents for nutrients and light. Fruits are plants' way of tricking animals into eating their seeds. So while we'll throw this away, for animals, everything goes in, and then later, everything comes out, complete with fertilizer. Besides my dog, who would eat a seed that smells like a dead animal? Well, the ginkgo is calling out to be eaten by a creature that's been dead for millions of years. We'll get back to that, but first, consider the avocado. Now, the avocados we eat today aren't that different from ones that grew in Mexico and Central America hundreds of thousands of years ago. You've got a thick skin, this nice, nutrient-rich, oily flesh, and right there in the middle, this ridiculously big seed. Something had to carry that seed away. The problem is that nothing alive in Mexico or Central America today could eat an avocado, seed and all, without choking to death or experiencing some serious discomfort. No one told the avocado, but it keeps making a fruit for an animal that doesn't exist anymore. Oh hey look, an avocado tree and a giant ground sloth. He's hungry, and he's about the size of a moving truck, so reaching those avocados is no problem for him. Since avocado seeds contain toxins, he just chews them enough to break open the flesh. Down they go, skin, seeds, and all. And as he walks off, his guts go to work. And since avocados contain natural laxatives, it's not long before you get the idea. And every so often, one of those seeds could grow into a new tree. In fact, this is how it worked for a bunch of weird tropical fruits. The one thing they have in common is that the animals they used to depend on are all extinct. Now, these living plant extinct animal relationships are what's called an evolutionary anachronism. Biologists Daniel Jansen and Paul Martin made this idea famous back in 1982. In fact, all of us carry evolutionary anachronisms. Goosebumps, our appendix, facial hair. These are traits that we evolved but we're no longer being selected for. Prehistoric megafauna, the animals that used to disperse all these seeds, went extinct by about 10,000 years ago. And since then, all these plants have just been limping along without them. Now, normally these evolutionary anachronisms might be the first step to these plants going extinct. But since we agricultural apes have been planting orchards full of them for thousands of years, well, it's not really an issue. We've sort of sidestepped natural selection. The avocado should have gone the way of the dodo, except that we think it tastes good. Just like there's no reason the ginkgo biloba should exist, except that it gives really nice shade. It's kind of nice that we can do more than just drive things to extinction, that we can save a plant whose friends are all dead. So thanks to some ghosts of evolution, a ginkgo tree grows in Brooklyn, dropping stinky seeds and waiting for a creature that will never come. If you want to read more about weird fruits and evolutionary anachronism.
All right. So, here we go. Back. So then honey locust, Kentucky coffee trees, 2 of our native species are both botanical anachronisms, and then the others that we saw. One interesting thing too about ginkgo, if you're familiar with those, the seeds are very edible. It's that outer covering that smells so bad. So if you get past that, the seeds are very commonly used in Asian cuisine. But you can remove that seed coat and then roast the seeds. You definitely want to cook them because they contain some toxins that are heat unstable and will break down in the heat. So that's our first plant, and that's where the mastodon part of the talk title comes in. And now here's one for the water gardener crowd, for you folks. One of my all-time favorite plants. So I just gave you a clue as to which one this could be, a plant that could be both a farmer and a hunter. And here's an image of it, which I hope I put in the right order on the sheet that I sent around. And as you're looking at it, you'll see this is an aquatic plant, grows completely submerged underwater. It has these very lacy, thin, filamentous kinds of leaves. And then all over the surface of the leaves would be these little bladders. So this particular plant is called bladderwort. Wort is kind of a generic term for plant. Back in medieval days, it would be used to refer especially to a medicinal plant. But this is in the genus Utricularia. And there are quite a few species in Minnesota, and they all do pretty much the same thing. So these are carnivorous plants. They're one of our Minnesota carnivores, as you may already know. But as I had mentioned, the traps and the leaves grow completely underwater. But when they flower, they send up this beautiful yellow snapdragon-like flower above the surface of the water. So if you've ever seen those as you're kind of walking around ponds, and maybe some of you have these growing in your pond gardens, they're really beautiful flowers. Now, if we take a closer look at these traps, here's a scanning electron micrograph image of it in the lower left. And you can see the trap itself made up of a bunch of cells, and then they have these trigger hairs on one end of it, and then the actual opening to the trap is that thing, that darker area right in the middle. Image on the lower right, we'll see a couple traps, and then this trap that's enlarged has a little crustacean that is captured, and the trap in the upper right corner has caught a little mayfly larva that's been kind of sucked into the trap itself and is feeding on it. Just to give you an idea of how cool these traps are, I'll try this other little mini movie clip here. I'm gonna have to probably unshare again. All right, so then I go here. So now what do I have to do? I have to escape out of here. Yep, so stop sharing here. I think I have to reshare. Sorry, this is so clunky. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is. No? Yeah, let's open it up again. And if we have to, it's this one here. Can you see this?
No, we're actually seeing your list.
Oh. All right, so now that should be open. So now I have to stop sharing, and now there has to be a better way of doing this. This is it. Where'd it go? So there it is. It's open. Now, can you see it?
Nope.
You may have to stop playing these clips if this doesn't work as well as I was hoping for. Oh, there it is. All right, let's try that. How about now? One more time.
There it is.
Oh, sorry. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Here we go.
This marsh seems quiet, but terrible things take place underwater. Stagnant waters are poor in nutrients. Once there, you've got to live by your wits. What use could these little bugs be? Stuck to bladderwort's roots. This is a bladderwort's leaf. It does the plant some favor. but let's leave water for a more comfortable place and sample a fragment carrying such small bladder-shaped leaves. High-speed camera is needed because... Oops! Even slowed down 10 times, it remains quick. Let's slow down much more. The prey comes closer and... Catch only lasted 1 millisecond. This small freshwater crustacean is still moving, but the digestive enzymes of the plants are already at work. In a few hours, only its skeleton will be left. And the plant will be enjoying its precious nutrients. Well, enjoying not always. How does it work? Small glands pump water to the outside, which creates a depression inside. Trap needs around 1 hour to set. Like in a bow, elastic energy is stored in the deformed material until both sides almost touch. Here it is. The trap is set, ready to catch its prey. Just touch its sensitive hairs and it reacts. This is the fastest known underwater trap. Door is the key. When depression inside the bladder is important enough, even the smallest perturbation can trigger inversion. Here also, a simulation helps understanding the deformation of the door. It first inverts its curvature, and as soon as the doorstep is passed, water flows in the underpressurized bladder, which forces a wide opening. It's like with this rubber popper toy. Curvature inversions can generate very swift movements. Once water has flown into the bladder, door rolls its fold back to outward curvature. Then the trap is watertight again. Who is the next victim?
And who is the next victim is exactly right. All right, so with any luck, we're back to where we started. So the bladderwort then has all of these little traps all over the surface of its leaves that basically suck in prey. We saw how it pumps water out and creates that negative pressure inside. So when the trigger hairs deform the opening, it just sucks in water with any kind of critter that might be floating by. All right, so now the original question was, which plant is both a hunter and a farmer? Well, these plants are green, so they're certainly farmers in the sense that the plant itself can make their own food. But if we look at a close-up of a trap, so here's a single trap, and it's been falsely colored, but it's a beautiful image. And down here, you can see all these little things that are floating in there. And those are algae. And so there's been some speculation that this trap not only serves as a device to capture insects to digest and capture all these little aquatic crustaceans, but it's also serving as a way of, as a little pasture that it's kind of acting as a farmer herding these little algae, and it's using the sugars that the algae are producing for its own food and survival. So it's essentially acting as a farmer raising cattle with the algae inside. So it may be doing both, acting as a hunter and as a farmer. All right, so let's look then at the next part of the talk title. We asked, what do Abe Lincoln, now, so here's our Lincoln part. What do Abe Lincoln, Tom Hanks, and dairy cows all have in common? You know, if you're my students, I give you a couple seconds to think about it and give me an answer. And I'll bet you know this. Water gardeners are a clever group. The thing that unifies the three of them would be Nancy Hanks Lincoln. All right, well, Lincoln, this was his mom. So we've got the Lincoln connection. And then the Tom Hanks connection is Tom Hanks is a distant relative of the Hanks family. So he has that connection. But now the question would be, well, where do the cows come from? And you might realize that Nancy Hanks Lincoln died of a disease called milk sickness. Milk sickness was a very common disease back in the days of the settlement of the prairies, back in the 1800s as settlers were moving west. And they realized that they were getting sick from drinking milk that was coming from a cow. And so hence it was called milk sickness. But they never really figured out why the cows were getting sick and why they were getting sick. It took them many, many years to actually solve the riddle. And it's hard now to appreciate what a serious disease and problem this was for the early settlers. In many cases, up to 50% of the settlers in some villages died from milk sickness. And they all had a characteristic sweet acetone-like smell of their breath. They had kind of neurological problems and a bunch of other problems and eventually just simply died, unfortunately. And thanks to milk sickness, Illinois is now called the land of Lincoln because after Nancy Hanks Lincoln died, well, they were living in Indiana, southern Indiana at the time. And after she passed from milk sickness, Abe's dad said, we're not hanging here anymore. And then he moved the family to Illinois. And so the state of Illinois has this disease to thank for their motto. Finally realized that this problem was being caused by a plant, white snakeroot, which is a very common plant in our woods here in Minnesota. White snakeroot will flower in the fall, so usually by mid-August to September, you'll see this one blooming. And it's actually one of the few plants that will bloom in the woods in the fall. So it does very well in shady areas. One way to tell it is if you look at the leaves very closely, you'll see there's a leaf miner that is a very good botanist and always lays its eggs between the upper and the lower layer of the leaves of this plant. So when the larvae hatch, they wind up eating their way through the leaf tissue, and they leave the upper layer of the leaf and the lower layer of the leaf intact so that they're still protected. And neither of those layers of the leaf have any green chlorophyll in them. So you can see these white tunnels that run throughout the leaf. Now, if you had a fresh leaf, you can actually see where mama insect laid her eggs and the larvae hatched because the tunnels get wider and wider as the insect got bigger and bigger. And it's hard to tell in this image, but you can kind of see if we started somewhere like over here, it goes around, comes up, the tunnel's getting wider, 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 wider. So it's kind of reaching its peak width right about here. And then once the insect got big enough, the larvae kind of pops out, falls into the soil and pupates, and the system continues. And it's caused by a fly, I believe. Now, the reason this plant is so toxic is it contains an oily extract called trematol, which contains this chemical down below here. And what that chemical trematone does is it basically blocks your liver from being able to metabolize things like alcohol and many other materials. And the sweet smell of the breath is actually due to one of the byproducts of when alcohol or if you exercise a lot, lactate is metabolized and you can't break it down completely, you'll get that particular odor. And that's ultimately what will kill those individuals. So white snake root was this terrible problem. The good news is it's not a problem anymore for two reasons. One is once we figured it out, the simple way to prevent milk sickness is to keep the cows out of the woods. So cows are smart enough not to want to graze on these plants because they know they're toxic. But the active ingredient preferentially goes into the milk of lactating cows. And so the calves were the ones that normally developed the symptoms of this disease. It was called trembles in the calves. But simply keep the cows out of the woods. Then the other reason it's not a big problem anymore is if a farmer does happen to have a cow go in and munch on one of these plants, we pool milk now in such huge volumes that the small amount of trematol that you might actually get would be very minor, plus the pasteurization process helps as well. So not really a big concern, but it wasn't determined. We didn't figure this out until the early part of the 1900s where this particular disease was coming from. So very significant problem, but fortunately it's been solved.
We have one of our members actually cultivating white snake root in her garden.
Oh, is that right? Oh, cool. They're beautiful plants. But she may just don't eat it. That would be my advice there. Admire, but don't munch on it.
And if she buys a cow,
great.
don't let the cow go in the woods.
Or keep the cow out of there, yeah. All right, so the next question would be, which of our local plants produces underground fruits and seeds? And here's a picture of a peanut plant. So you want to think peanuts. And we know what peanuts do. The flowers are above ground. They get pollinated, then the stalk elongates and it buries the peanut. All right, so I'll give you a clue to the answer for this question. Here's a picture of it. It has these three leaflets. Looks a little bit like poison ivy, except the margins of the leaf are smooth, whereas poison ivy has toothed margins, coarsely toothed margins. It's a twining vine. You kind of see these viney-like stems here. It's hard to tell in this image, but these plants generally don't get more than about a foot or so, maybe 2 feet off the ground. They seem to like areas that get some shade during the day. And so for that reason, they typically prefer forest edges along paths and things like that. They're common in the eastern US. And if you haven't figured it out already or haven't seen this plant before, this one is called hog peanut. And its scientific name is Amphicarpea bracteata. All right, so that's all well and good, but let's look at some fun facts about this particular plant. Well, if you think about the scientific name, it's really very appropriate in this particular case. If we think about frogs, which are amphibians, then we'll get an idea of where the amphi part comes from. Amphibians live on both land and water, so it essentially means both. And then the carpea part of the scientific name comes from a carpel or a seed. So literally translated, this plant produces seeds both above and below the ground, kind of like a peanut. All right, so let's take a little detour now and talk about violets for a second here, because violets provide a great example of two different kinds of flowers that plants will produce. The normal violet type flower that has, the purple petals or sometimes whites or yellows, depending upon the species, where they have these beautiful lines or nectar guides leading into the flower. They have a color, they have an odor, they have a nectar. These kinds of flowers are called chasmogamous flowers by us botany nerds. which simply means that the flowers will open up for pollination. So this flower is looking that beautiful in order to attract pollinators to come in and, rub the pollen on it and then move to another flower to transfer pollen from one to another. Well, many plants, like the violet, also produce what are called cleistogamous flowers. And these are flowers that remain closed. They never open up for pollination. So in the image in the lower right, these are the cleistogamous flowers of the violet. So you can see they're pretty boring looking for the most part. They have no color, they have no nectar, no odor, and rather than being produced on a long stalk, they're typically produced on a short stalk very close to the base of the plant. And all that makes sense. These flowers never open up for pollination, so they self-pollinate, which has a fail-safe mechanism to ensure that the violet will produce at least a little bit of seed. Because if you're waiting for a pollinator, that can be kind of a risky thing. You're not guaranteed that a pollinator will eventually come visit your flower. All right, so with that little bit of background, let's go back and look at our friend hog peanut. It gets its scientific name because it produces both chasmogamous flowers and cleistogamous flowers. So the chasmogamous flowers are kind of your normal ones, and they're produced above ground. So that's what this abbreviation aerial CH chasmogamous means. So here's what they look like. They're kind of small pea-like flowers. They look a little bit like a snapdragon flower, or I'm sure you're familiar with them. And they produce small bean pods. Those bean pods may be 2 to 3 inches long, and they produce little lentil-like seeds that are much smaller than a lentil, but you can eat them if you want to go to the effort to collect them. Now it also produces chasmogamous flowers and seeds. And so on the right here would be 2 hog peanut plants that I dug up, and you'll see it underground here, there's some chasmogamous seeds and flowers. And also you'll see at least one pod that's coming from a cleistogamous flower. So the cleistogamous flowers are produced underground, and they develop into another kind of weird legume. So think of a bean with only a single seed, and they have a very papery-like covering to it. These are about the size of, it's hard to tell in the palm of the hand here, but they're each about the size of a garbanzo bean, a chickpea. And like chickpeas and garbanzo beans, they are edible. So they, and they taste good. They're just hard to collect. Most of the seeds this plant produces are coming from these underground cleistogamous flowers. And as it turns out, if you were to plant the seeds that come from the underground pods and the seeds from the above ground pods, which unfortunately I don't have a picture of, these underground ones grow faster, they have better germination, and the plants go larger than the other ones. So they have a lot of pluses to them, but the negative thing about the underground seeds is they're self-pollinated, so there's no genetic diversity. And that's usually overall in the long haul, a bad thing for plants. But the reason that hog peanut does it, it's a super smart strategy when you think about it. What these plants do is if they're growing in good conditions, kind of along a trail with a lot of light and less dark, so anything less than about 10.5 hours of dark, these plants produce mostly the above ground flowers and the above ground plants, seeds. However, if they're growing in bad conditions where they have much more dark during the day than they do light, they tend to produce more of the underground seeds. And the reason for that is if they have a lot of light, that means they can make their own food. And so food is not going to be limited for them. So they can afford to make lots of flowers that might not get pollinated. However, if they're in poor conditions, they're going to be a little less well-fed. And so the amount of food they get is going to be important. And they can't afford to waste it on flowers that might not get pollinated. And so it's sort of a fail-safe mechanism to ensure that they're going to have seeds and have plenty of them, even though the conditions might not be so favorable. So in this case, these plants then do both, and you can eat both of these. So if you find a nice big population of those, get out your trowel and you can dig them up and collect some. Then the hard part is getting rid of all the little gravel and grit from them. My secret trick is to, once you've collected, say, a handful of seeds like you see here, put them in a glass of water and then swirl them around. That'll help clean them, but if you swirl them, you'll hear any of the little gravel and grit tinkling against the side of the glass. So then you'll know, kind of remove that batch, do it again until eventually you don't hear any tinkling. And then you would cook them up just as you would a garbanzo bean. So really cool plants that produce flowers both above and below ground. All right, here's the next fun plant. One of my, well, all these are my favorite plants, I guess. And this is a plant that can actually smell, that we've proven that it can smell. So I'll give you a clue what it looks like. It's this yellow spaghetti-like stuff. And many of you might have already recognized this as another parasitic plant. This one is called dodder. And it's hard to tell, but it makes, you can see these yellow to white strands, so it makes absolutely no chlorophyll. We call it achlorophyllous. The orange color you see in there would be a group of pigments called carotenoids, which are the same kind of pigments you would find in carrots. But anyway, dodder can't make its own food. So that means it has to steal its carbohydrates as well as water and minerals from another host plant. And we call plants that are not green and have to steal everything from another plant a hollow parasite, simply meaning it's completely parasitic. Now that would contrast with some plants are hemiparasites. Hemi means half, so they're half parasitic. On the right would be a Indian paintbrush plant, and on the left is a lousewort. And these are common prairie plants here in Minnesota. And these are hemiparasites. And so what they do is they just steal water and minerals from the host plant, but not any carbohydrates. So they're green. They can make their own food through photosynthesis, but they have to have a connection to another plant for water and minerals. Mistletoe, which we kiss under at the Christmas season, is another good example of a hemiparasite. It lives in oaks and other trees, more commonly down south. So what makes it a parasite? They possess a weird root system that's called a hostorium, or plural hostoria. And what these hostoria do is they have a connection to the transport tissues of the plant. So in this image in the upper right, you'll see the outer yellowish part would be our friend dodder. And then it sends in its hostorium, and now it's going into one of the vascular tissues, and it's stealing water and carbohydrates from the host plant that is infected. In the image in the lower right, you'll see the dodder's been removed from this stem. You can see the little scars that left where the hostorium basically has been ripped off of that plant and now has been removed. All right, so let's go back to smelling. So imagine now that you're a dodder seedling, and when you germinate, you've got to make sure that you're going to find a host plant pretty quick. And so hopefully we'll get this next clip to work without boring you too much. In the lower left here, we'll see we've got a dodder seed, and then this would be the seedling. Note how long and whip-like they are. And here's one that's going after a tomato plant. And we'll try this. I hope it works. I think I have to do that. And then I have to go here, and where is it? Which movie was it? Daughter. All right, so now. Okay, so now that should be open. So if I say we'll close this and go share screen, we should find that movie. Oh, there it is. All right, with any luck, we're back. And
We're back there. There's your daughters.
all right, we'll give it a whirl here.
Wheat and tomato seedlings in the same pot and planted a newly sprouted daughter vine between them. Then they set up a time-lapse camera to see if the seedling was actually making a choice. For hours, it circles the air like a snake, as if sniffing out its victims. And 9 times out of 10, its preferred victim is the juicy tomato, a tender plant that's easier to attach to.
You really get the sense of a behavior response. So really, there's some fairly strong selection here for this plant to make the right decision. Otherwise, it will die.
But how was the little stem making its choice? The team decided to play a hunch. They knew that all plants produce green leaf volatiles, chemical scents released by their leaves as they breathe. So maybe this predatory plant actually was sniffing out its victim. To test that theory, the team devised another experiment. First, they captured the scent of a tomato, essentially condensing the chemical odor released by the plant. Once it's distilled, they present the tomato perfume to the vine, along with a real tomato it can't possibly smell. Time after time, the daughter hones in on the chemical language that says, "Yes, I'm a tomato."
So let's see here. We'll try to figure this out. All right, so the take-home message from that, whoops, there we go, is that plants like dodder and probably almost all others can actually detect these chemicals that are coming from other plants. There are lots and lots of examples, but this is probably one of the nicest and simplest ones. You may be familiar with the Indian pipe plant, and that one is snow white. It produces flowers, so this is a flowering plant. And here's a close-up of one of the flowers. So it's snow white. It cannot make its own food. And so how does this plant get its nourishment? Oh, and as here's some more of the individual plants. And as they are pollinated and they go to fruit, when they dry out, the stem straightens up and they grow straight up. And the plant basically turns black as it disperses its seeds. So you would guess that Indian pipe plants would be parasites because they lack any chlorophyll. You would think they might be just like the dodder plant, but as it turns out, they're not parasitic. And the reason they're not parasitic is because they don't have that hostorium, that root connection to another plant. So if they don't have a root connection and they don't have any chlorophyll, how do they get their nutrients? And the way they do it is by a fungus. And so you may be familiar that the roots of virtually, well, most plants, I'd say nearly all plants, have fungi associated with them. And these fungi form a covering around the roots, or they actually penetrate into the root, and then the fungal filaments go out into the soil. And it's a beautiful example of a symbiotic relationship. The fungus will transport water and minerals, especially into the host plant. And in exchange, the host plant will typically give it organic materials, sugars, and other things that the fungus needs to grow. So what happens in the case of Indian pipe is that they do get their nutrients from a fungus. But now the fungus has to get its food from someplace, and it can't get it from the Indian pipe plant. So what happens then is the fungus acts like a bridge between the Indian pipe and another plant. So the fungus attaches its filaments to the roots of the Indian pipe plant, and it attaches its roots, its filaments to the roots of another plant, say an oak tree. So as the nutrients from the oak go into the fungus, then they move into the Indian pipe. And so there's this back and forth exchange of materials. So a lot of cooperation is going on between plants and fungi in order to, for all of them to survive. So just because you can't make chlorophyll doesn't mean you're necessarily a parasite. Most of them are, but there are a few exceptions. All right, and then since it's near Easter, one plant I thought we would talk about would be the resurrection plants. And the image in the lower left shows the rusty woodsia fern. And these are pretty common if you go out into any rocky areas and kind of look around. Here in central Minnesota, you may have been to Quarry Park, which has a lot of granite outcrops. St. Cloud is the granite city. And so these ferns will grow in the cracks of the rocks. And as they're growing in the cracks of the rock, well, as you might guess, it's a pretty dry place. When it rains, that moisture will run off fairly quickly. And just a little of it will kind of get captured by the roots. So when the plants get some moisture, they're nice and green, like the one you can see here on the lower right left. But as they dry up, they'll turn nice and crunchy and brown. And they stay that brown color in this dormant phase for a long time. They can actually last in that phase for many years. Then when moisture comes back, they basically resurrect themselves. They absorb that moisture and they turn back green. There are mushrooms that do this same resurrection phenomenon. One of my favorites is called the fairy ring mushroom. And these are lawn mushrooms. And if you've ever seen an area of really dark green, ring of dark green grass, what you're looking at is the, under the soil there would be the filaments of this particular mushroom. And the reason it's so green is because it releases enzymes into the grass roots and into the soil that make nutrients available to the grass, so it turns greener and grows a little bit better. And then when conditions are favorable, the mushrooms will come up in that nice green area. So they're called fairy rings because of these nice rings of mushrooms that form and the rings of green grass. Well, these mushrooms are the same as the rusty woodsia, rusty cliff fern. They will dry up into basically this dried form, and then you put them back in water and bingo, they pop back to life essentially, and they can start shedding their spores again and doing their thing. In the Chihuahuan deserts, there's a similar plant called the resurrection plant. And this is actually one of the kind of lower non-flowering plants. And it can do the same basic phenomenon. And I'll show you, try another quick movie, see if this works. So I think I have to stop sharing. I think I open up the movie. Where'd it go? We'll open this up. Close that. All right, so now with any luck, it's still there. Then I go back to find it and it's gone. Hold on. So that should have done it. There we go. Sorry about this. All right, so with any luck, here's a little movie I made about this particular plant a year or two ago.
The Chihuahuan Desert, which extends from West Texas to Arizona and then south to north of Mexico City, is home to many interesting plants. Some of these include ocotillo, many species of cacti, including the prickly pear and the aromatic creosote bush. Perhaps no Chihuahuan desert plant is more interesting than the resurrection plant, Selaginella lepidophylla, which is also called the Rose of Jericho. This plant is commonly sold as a novelty in its dried form. When the plant dries, it forms a brown, tightly coiled ball between 6 and 8 centimeters in diameter. When you soak the plant in water, it uncoils, turns green, and begins to grow again. This amazing ability to dry to a fraction of its original weight and remain dormant until it is once again hydrated is known as anhydrobiosis. This word literally translates into life without water. When its environment dries up, an actively growing resurrection plant will begin to slowly curl and turn brown and lose its chlorophyll. The following video clip shows this process in action. The movie was made with a Microsoft LifeCam digital video camera using Stop Motion Pro image capture software. Images were taken every 3 minutes and compiled into a time-lapse movie. The total elapsed time for this scene is 15.2 hours. When water is once again available, the plant uncoils and reassembles its photosynthetic machinery. This next movie clip shows the same plant from the previous clip as it rehydrates after being placed in a dish of water. This scene is 21.7 hours long, and each image in the time-lapse movie was taken at 3-minute intervals. The ability to dry and revive presumably evolved in response to survival in habitats such as the rocky outcrops in the Chihuahuan Desert, where rains are sporadic and short-lived. The anhydrobiotic lifestyle allows the plant to live in such harsh environments and simply wait out drought periods in a dormant state. The next movie clip follows the same plant after it was removed from the dish of water and dried for a second time. The total elapsed time is 21.9 hours. Did you notice how the plant compresses itself into a tight, compact ball? It's hypothesized that the function of the curling response is to protect the main plant body from the intense light irradiances of the desert sun during the dry period. In fact, studies have shown that less than 0.3% of the incident light reaches the center of the curled ball. The advantage of this shading response is to prevent the formation of free radicals and other processes that would damage the photosynthetic apparatus and the plant's ability to recover when it was wetted. Anhydrobiosis is a phenomenal adaptation to survival in habitats like the desert areas with periodic moisture. This ability has evolved in more than 300 other plants, as well as in fungi such as yeast and animals such as nematodes, tardigrades, and rotifers. But that's another story.
All right.
How much water was used to rehydrate that plant then, Steve?
Yeah, I just put it in a little container of water so that the base was in the water. So it had full access to basically a cup of water.
Okay. Is that a plant that would be able to survive in a Minnesota winter? Or is
No.
that
Yeah, it can
definitely a house
tolerate
plant?
drought, but it can't tolerate our winters.
Okay.
Cold will do it in. So mostly as a novelty.
So a novelty house plant then.
Exactly. We can grow them in our greenhouse and keep them alive for a long time too, and so they would do well in that situation.
Is there a
Right,
certain is there a certain amount of times it can be dried out and revived?
You know, that's an excellent question, and I don't know the answer to it. I've kind of done that time-lapse video sequence, I think 3 or 4 times, and interestingly, every time it dries and revives, it takes longer for it to close back up again. So my guess is there is a limit, but I'm not sure what that would be.
Okay.
Let's see, maybe, look here, I'm trying to remember. So go back to sharing. So I think we're back here. And unfortunately, I have lots more plants I could talk about, but I think we're coming close to the end of the time period. Maybe the thing to do now is to open it up for questions. I mean, I could talk for hours, but perhaps to open it up for questions. And if you have any specific question about any of the plants that are on that sheet that I sent you, we could say a little bit about those as well. How would you like to work it, Steve?
If we have some questions, we can open it up to questions.
Should I keep going?
You know,
or
we can keep going.
I could keep going. I don't want to bore people.
Well, we haven't had anybody.
I can do.
Go ahead.
How about I'll do one of my another favorite plant here, and then we'll see how folks want to if we can go from there.
All right.
I'll show another little movie that one of my students made. All right, let's see if we can go to the next. Are we? Am I sharing now, or are we all? I don't know where I am here.
Nope. We did have a question. She was curious about the lotus that was on that sheet. Yeah, it's coming up.
Okay, sure. Let's see. Is this?
Yeah, you're back.
Am I sharing now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the reason I put the lotus on there and this one down here is jewelweed, would be 2 of the water garden plants that you might see and experience. And well, they're beautiful plants, number one, but the reason I put them in here is these particular plants have inspired a variety of different cool commercial creations. And so question we might want to ask here is, what product have the water lotus and jewelweed inspired? And then you may be familiar with, this is a hedge apple, and here's its stem, and here's a cocklebur. What products have they inspired? And so if we look at the water lotus and jewelweed, what they've inspired would be self-cleaning paints. And I'll bet you've noticed that if you drop a little bit of water on the leaves of your lotus, or you've noticed on jewelweed that water just beads up as these little silver beads, hence the other common name for it, jewelweed or touch-me-not is another name for it because the pods will explode. But the reason that happens is that the leaf surfaces of both the water lotus and the jewelweed are very, very water repellent or hydrophobic. And if we look closely at the surface of the leaves, they have tiny little protrusions that are made of waxes. And so when a droplet, which are very water repellent, so when a drop of water hits the surface of one of these leaves, then they bead up and will roll right off very quickly. And it keeps the leaves free from moisture, anything from growing on them. So it's a pretty neat strategy. Well, someone got the bright idea that, well, maybe we can take advantage of this and use it to create a product to keep our buildings clean and our walls clean. And so what this German did is to incorporate these waxy type of beads into paints and then use them to paint the outside of buildings. So now when any dirt and water hit it, it basically just runs right off as it would off the surface of a water lotus leaf and keeps it nice and clean. For the other ones,
one of our members was saying maybe the cocklebur inspired Velcro.
Absolutely. So cocklebur was the definite inspiration for Velcro by a Swiss fellow who was walking his dog, removed the cockleburs, and got the bright idea that that would make a good fastener. A similar plant that you might even be more familiar with would be burdock. It has similar kinds of fruits, same kind of phenomenon there. And then these hedge apples, they don't grow around in Minnesota. They're not quite hardy enough to do well. Maybe they're at the Landscape Arboretum, but you don't see them very often. But if you go to the south and west a little bit more, they're very common. And so these fruits are large, but I know that our local supermarkets actually sell these every fall as an anti-spider device. You're supposed to put these in the corners of your home and they will repel spiders. But as it turns out, these hedge apples, or Osage orange is another name for them, or bow dark, which stands for wood of the bow. The wood of this tree was used for making bows very commonly because it's very strong yet flexible. And the trees have these branches that have thorns at intervals. And this was the inspiration for barbed wire that I forget the fellow's name that created it, but realized, oh, you know what? This would be pretty cool. And now, even now, many people will plant these as hedgerows, and they serve almost as a living hedge to maintain your pastures and as a way of keeping animals out. Any others from the plants on the sheet, or that you'd like to talk more about or hear more about?
No questions coming up, so.
All right, well, we'll go back to one last one here. And this is a plant that can switch sexes. And it's probably one that's familiar to most of us. And I'll give you a couple of hints here, and you might have already seen the images of it. So, and it's on the sheet. But this particular plant is also dioecious, just like the honey locust. So it has separate male plants and separate females. They're really cool. Once the seeds germinate, they remain in a juvenile period for as long as 5 years before they actually will be able to flower. And the tissues are just thick with these needle-like crystals. called raphids. And so you don't want to go eating this plant, because if you do, it would be like eating some Halloween candy that some pervert put some sewing needles in. You just bite down on it and it will just irritate the heck out of the lining of your throat. And you may have already guessed this plant is Jack in the Pulpit. So some plants are actually Jills and some are Jacks. If we look closely at the flowering stalk, you can kind of look at the base. And if you look closely, you'll see this one has kind of the big fat beady-like structures that are going to turn into the fruits. So this would be a Jill. And this one over here is going to have the male stamen. So that would be a true Jack. And so these plants can change sex. So one year, the plant can come up and make male flowers, a Jack. Another year, it could come up and make just female flowers, and it can flip-flop back and forth. So for these plants, sex is kind of relative, and it all depends on the growing conditions. So initially, those young seedlings can't flower at all. They're neutered. They can't make any male or female flowers. But then after about 7 years, the plants get big enough where they can actually begin to flower. And when they do produce flowers, they produce the male flowers, the Jacks. Then in another year or two, they get a little bit larger. They have a corm underground. And that once that corm gets big enough, then they come back as a female. So whether they flower as a male or female or produce no flowers at all will depend on the growing season of the previous year. So if it was a good growing season, adequate moisture, then the next year they typically come back as a female because they have lots of time for the bulbs, the corms to get lots of nutrients. If it wasn't a great growing season, they'll come back as a male. And if it was a really bad year, then they'll may come back and not be able to flower at all. So they can flip-flop back and forth depending upon their sex. Now,
I have a question. Is that true of all adroids, like voodoo lilies?
Good question. They're certainly related to the voodoo lilies and the other aroids. My guess is it would be true, but I don't know that anyone's done that research study. So I think it probably would hold true, but I don't know for a fact. But not all aroids are single-sexed either. So many of them have both male and female flowers in the same container like this. And voodoo lilies, I've only ever grown one or two, so I don't remember on them. But so yes, for those that produce single-sex plants, it probably is true. Now you may be familiar with dumb canes, may have that even growing as a house plant. As a little bit of trivia, dumb canes are probably responsible for more calls to poison control centers than any other plant. And it gets its name dumb because if you were to eat it, it would make you go dumb because of the irritation of the lining of your throat. And that's because it contains these crystals that we see here. And when you start munching on it, and likewise, most of our aroids, peace lilies, dracaenas, monsteras, most all of them have these kinds of crystals in them. But dumb cane takes it one step further, and it actively injects these crystals into you if you were to munch on it. And let's see if we can show this movie. I wish there was a way. I tried to have them all open at the same time. Oops. But I couldn't figure out how to do it on my computer. Let's see, where is it now? Oops. All right, now what? I think we can close that. Close that. I have to go back to share. I think our movie is there. All right, here we go. Hopefully you're still with me and
Yep.
Can be able to see it. I'm just going to jump up here. All right, so here's one of my students who made a movie of these things. So here in this image, you can see all these little lines in the middle upper part of the screen. Those are the raphids, or those needle-like crystals. And in this particular plant, they're produced in a football-shaped cell that you can see here that has a little nipple-like structure on either end. And if you were to eat the dumb cane, what you would do is you would wind up chewing on these things. And if you break off that nipple-like end, what happens then is that these structures start shooting those crystals out into the lining of your throat, just like a blowgun. And we'll just take a peek at that.
Think does not simply release a noxious chemical. In addition to toxins, there are specialized cells in the plant's tissue called idioblasts that, when damaged, fire out calcium oxalate crystals called raphids. The crystals are long and spear-shaped with barbs at the end. When the raphids are ejected, they may puncture tissue, causing irritation and swelling.
You can tell a student made that by the difference in the music.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't want to go eating Jack in the Pulpit, or certainly not dumb cane, for the reason that you might get those crystals in your throat. So I don't want to overstay my welcome, but if you have, I'm happy to answer questions or talk about any of the other plants on the list if you would like.
I do have a question. While we're waiting, if somebody else has a question, can you maybe kind of give us a little quick rundown on the herbarium? I wish I could say it correctly.
No worries. I pronounce it herbarium. An herbarium or herbarium is a collection of pressed, dried, labeled, and identified plants. So it's essentially a reference library of plants. St. John's, St. Ben's, we have a collection of 32,000 specimens in our herbarium, which makes us the largest private college herbarium in the state. So I'm really proud of that. But the University of Minnesota has nearly 1 million specimens. So from a global perspective, we're small potatoes, but for a school our size, we have a great collection. And so it's just a place where you can go and figure out if you want to know what a dandelion looks like, you can go to the collections and see what they look like, or where they grow, or when they flower. So essentially just a wealth of information.
Okay. Well, if we have any blooming biologists, we can send them up your way and you can
please do
run them through there.
Yeah, and if you guys are in the area, I'd be happy to give you a tour of the herbarium at any time too. Just let me know.
Jan wants to know, was one of your plants bloodroot?
No, but let's see, which one might have looked like bloodroot? I'm trying to remember on the sheet.
The white flower. Apparently has a white flower on it.
That might be the white snake root. Here's my new one. So if you have a copy of the handout in front of you, just kind of go through them quickly. In the upper left corner would be the honey locust, then bladderwort, then white snake root, hog peanut, then dodder. Whoops.
It's the one above the lotus.
And the one above the lotus, oh, that would be a great question. That's a strawberry flower. And the reason I put that in there is because, let's see, where is it here? Sorry about that. The reason I put that in there is I could have asked you a question about strawberries. Let's see, here is actually the next one.
Okay.
If you like to drink Snapple, there they had what were called Snapple Fun Facts. And Snapple Fun Fact number 136 is that strawberries are the only fruits with the seeds on the outside. And my question for you is this statement true or not? And I'm sure everyone knows it's not, but it sure looks that way, and it certainly did to the marketing people at Snapple. And the reason we know it's not true is because if we start looking at how fruits and seeds develop, we can look at a flower. Let's see. It's not going now. So here's a cross section through a flower. And we know that a fruit will come from the carpel or the pistil of the flower. And the fruit forms from actually the ovary of the flower that contained the ovules which develop into the seeds. So in a normal plant, in any typical plant, we have, the seeds develop within the fruit. So the seeds develop from the ovules, which are inside the ovary. Ovaries develop into fruits, ovules develop into seeds. So then the question is, well, what's the deal with all these seedy-like structures on the surface of the strawberry? Well, if we look at a strawberry flower has, well, in this case, 6 petals. It has lots of stamens in it, but it's hard to tell, but in the very center, strawberry flowers have lots and lots of those pistils, each with an ovary. And in each one of the ovaries is a single ovule that makes a single seed. So what happens when a strawberry gets pollinated, the flower starts to enlarge, and each one of these pistils will develop into a small little fruit that each has a single seed in it. So dotting the surface of the strawberry, each of these comes from a separate pistil of the flower with a separate ovary, each having a single seed. So you're really eating a whole bunch of botanical true fruits, each that are single seeded. And the fleshy part of the seed actually comes from what we call the receptacle, and that's the base of the flower where all the other flower parts are attached. So it's always true that seeds are inside of fruits, at least as they're developing. The fruit may open up to release the seeds, like in a milkweed, but it's never true that a fruit will have the seeds on the outside. So unfortunately, Snapple got it wrong.
Good marketing tool, though.
But a good marketing tool, exactly. Any other questions or any of the other plants on the sheet that you would like to know more about?
I'm not seeing any, Stephen. I really want to thank you for your time. It was quite entertaining for myself. I will speak for myself. I think everybody else, we didn't lose anybody during the presentation, and it looks like everybody stayed awake. So I thought it was quite well.
That's half the battle. So you're doing better than my students if you didn't fall asleep. So I appreciate that.
All right.
Although I'm sure Paul would never have fallen asleep in a class, but maybe the other ones.
Yeah, I think Nicole might have. Well, I wanted to thank you again for your time. If nobody else has any questions,
My pleasure, and maybe we'll come visit the herbarium, or maybe I'll see you at a water garden meeting sometime.
that would be wonderful. That would be great.
Thank you so much for the invite. Have a
Thank
great
you. Have a
day.
great day. All right, now if everybody will just bear with me.